Welcome to AASHTO Resource Q&A. We're taking time to discuss construction materials testing and inspection with people in the know. From exploring testing problems and solutions to laboratory best practices and quality management, we're covering topics important to you.
Welcome to AASHTO Resource Q&A. I'm Brian Johnson.
And I'm Kim Swanson, and we are continuing our discussion today in part 2 of the section 3.5 of the AASHTO Accreditation Program Manual. So if you didn't listen to the first part, I encourage you to go back because you go through all of the background of what the procedure manual is and how it's approved and all that fun stuff. But I think we're going to just dive right in to this next one. What do you think?
I think that's a good idea, and I'm sure people just could not wait for part 2. So the wait is over.
Yes,
we get to
I know.
Continue the conversation.
On bated breath, I'm sure. So picking up where we left off, if I recall correctly, we will be at, and I know this one has your favorite words in it, but it is section 3.5.8, and it says the laboratory shall be organized in such a way that confidence in its independence of judgment, integrity, and impartiality is maintained at all times. And those are like all of your favorite words, Brian.
They are. That sentence has it all: confidence, judgment, integrity, impartiality. Some of my favorite words.
All of those things. So let's dive into what that actually means.
Yeah, and this definitely falls under the category of I want this one in my back pocket. Because if we have an issue with integrity, falsification of records, I'd say this also conflicts of interest. So we do have from time to time issues where a laboratory may be they may have some built-in conflicts of interest. So let's say it's supposed to be an independent or third-party testing lab, but they're owned by the company that produces the material that is supposed to have the impartial testing performed on it. That is a conflict of interest. Now, conflict of interest is inherently problematic, but it does have to be recognized and dealt with. So if there is a situation where a conflict of interest exists, laboratory has to be really careful to explain what that is, how they mitigate it, what is the situation that exists where the conflict of interest is remedied. And if they can't do that, then that's a problem. And that is also one of those things I'd want to bring to our oversight committee to see if they agree before we just say, no, you can't be accredited. But we have had labs that we've refused accreditation because of conflicts of interest and integrity problems.
Well, hopefully few and far between.
Yeah, that would be great. And I would love to have no more of those if we could, but I know that that's not possible. But we will deal with them as we find them. Next one, personnel shall have necessary education, training, technical knowledge, and experience for their assigned functions. Super subjective on that one as well. But I think the technical knowledge and experience, it is shown by performance, right?
Yeah. Can you do your job?
If you can do your job, then great. I think education has been a real tough one for us over the years because there are requirements for biographical sketches, for example, in R18 to include education and experience. Some people don't really have a lot of education. That may be because of circumstances that they're dealt with, right?
Yeah. Formal education, you mean?
Formal,
you mean
formal
education.
Formal education. And it doesn't necessarily indicate that their job performance is going to be impaired in any way. So I think that, if I were to be able to make a unilateral decision on that, I would probably remove education from that because I think it's difficult, and it also kind of puts people, like I've noticed people who haven't had opportunities to get higher education or often they don't feel great about having to add education to their credentials when they don't view that as something that that doesn't make or break them. That doesn't define them. So they don't really want to put that on there. And I kind of agree with that. If they're doing a good job, and I mean, what does it matter for accreditation if they put that on their biographical sketch or not?
Yeah, I would say in this scenario, education and training are kind of synonymous, where because you're like, are you trained to do it? Like, do you have the knowledge to do it? That's all we care about for the most
Right.
part, right?
That's right.
So I don't know, maybe it's just the definition of education as well.
Yeah, that is true because there's all kinds of education, right?
Yes, there definitely is. So are we going in order of all of these? I didn't know if we were going in
We were.
specific
I was
order.
going to skip around, but we're kind of plowing through it.
Yeah, okay. So we're at 3.5
Okay,
point.
I think I'm gonna
You're
jump
gonna
over.
skip?
I'm
Okay,
gonna
good.
skip a couple. Well, I'm not
Okay.
gonna skip them. I'm just gonna mention the next one is about reporting results accurately, objectively, and without bias. That's more of what we already talked about.
Mm-hmm.
Laboratory has to have good organizational practices and have good housekeeping. So that's one of those.
Mm-hmm.
If we go to a laboratory that's just trashed and not well maintained, and it affects their testing, then that could be something we would write.
Yeah.
Workload has to be consistent with their equipment. I think that has a couple aspects of it. Some just about having appropriate equipment to handle the workload, which we wouldn't be able to tell. But also, if they were trying to be accredited for something that they don't even have the equipment of,
Yeah.
we wouldn't want that. So I think that would fall into that category and
Well, they
just under
couldn't.
the test method.
Yeah, they
Y-
could. Yeah, could they?
You know,
They
I
couldn't get
said
a
that
credit.
yeah, you would think they would say, how could I get accredited for this? I don't even have the equipment. And yet
Well,
people try
well, I
sometimes.
mean, in my head, it's like let them pay for that to be assessed on that, but they're not going to get accredited without the
No, they
equipment.
won't. They won't.
So, like,
And
why does it like anyway? Go
it's a
ahead.
great question. It's a great question. I wish I had the answer to it. I think
Okay.
sometimes people they plan to have things before a certain date and they just don't show up on time.
Yeah.
And like that can be an impairment, but that's
Yeah.
not really indicative of their problem.
Yeah.
It's just that they got ahead of themselves. But the fact remains we have to come back when you have it because we can't really watch you do something with nothing.
Yeah.
We've also had people say, "Can I just rent everything?" And no, you can't. You want to be accredited, you have to be an actual testing laboratory with equipment and personnel and all of that stuff.
It would never even occur to me to ask if I could just rent the equipment.
Yeah, some people they have this idea that this is a real chicken egg problem.
Mm.
Like I have to be accredited before I can do any work. So can you just accredit me based on my intentions? And no, we cannot. So, I mean, even if you have to do work that's non-accredited work until you get your feet wet and can actually get accredited, then you should probably figure out how to do that. But I do think that there is a problem, like a real problem out there in certain areas where I think that the specifying agencies really have to understand that
Mm.
you can't just automatically snap your fingers and get accredited. Some of the airport authorities kind of struggle with this where they'll have a contract and they might have like a multi-year contract to work on
Mhm.
airport facilities. And they'll say, okay, well, this person won the contract. We expect on day one for them to move in and be accredited, but it can't work that way.
Mhm.
So while they're moving in, while they're transitioning staff, while they're doing all these things, they can't have us there while that's all happening. So they have to get set up, kind of work out the bugs and make sure everything's operating properly, then they can get their assessment, and then it takes time for them to resolve issues, and then they get accredited. So what would be appropriate for those agencies is to give a certain time frame in which the laboratory can obtain the accreditation once they take hold of that contract. Next one that we're going to talk about is labs have to pay all the fees for services. That's pretty obvious, but it is a requirement because we aren't going to just accredit without people paying for the services.
And does that include not just the accreditation invoices from AASHTO Resource or, yeah, from AASHTO Resource, but any of the assessment or inspection or proficiency samples as well? So they have to be all paid.
That's right, and it extends beyond just AASHTO, right? So
Hmm.
it whoever provides their assessments or proficiency samples, if it leads to AASHTO accreditation, they have to fulfill their obligation to pay those bills as well, because if they can not continue to receive those services, then they can't maintain their accreditation.
Going on, the next one I'm seeing has multiple parts. The other ones were pretty straightforward, and so let's dive into 3.5.14.
Okay, 3.5.14 is the last section in this, the last subsection in this section. And it says for those test methods for which the laboratory is seeking accreditation, laboratory has to maintain facilities for proper control of the laboratory environment. Laboratory has to maintain facilities for storage, handling, and conditioning of test specimens and samples. Laboratory has to maintain necessary calibration equipment and reference standards. So that would be like if you standardize your own ovens and bath temperatures and thermometers, you'd have to have a reference thermometer, for example. Laboratory has to maintain facilities and equipment conforming to specification requirements necessary for testing. So that we're getting into a lot of like R18 Procedures Manual crossover here.
That's what I was actually just thinking of. Why is this in the procedures manual and not in an actual standard?
That is a good question. And I think some of this stuff could get removed from the app procedures manual. The next one is the one that has created, and this was kind of the cause of the disruption for this particular customer that kind of prompted this corrective action episode. And that it is that the laboratory has to have test areas, energy sources, lighting, heating, cooling, and ventilation necessary to facilitate performance of tests. And then it says the testing environment when workers are present in normally occupied spaces inside facilities, fixed, mobile, or temporary, shall be maintained at 60 to 85 degrees Celsius.
Question about that real quick.
Yes.
How was that range determined, the 60 to 80 Fahrenheit?
So the original ballot for this item did include, so the original text had heating but not cooling in it. So that ballot item included cooling, and then it also added this idea of what a reasonable laboratory temperature would be. The reason is because we have heating and cooling, but really no parameters. So it's kind of hard to tell what you're even talking about there. And I went back and looked at the actual ballot item, and it just vaguely said that this is recommended temperature range for a professional laboratory setting that should be able, that's kind of the end of the rationale. But the idea is that a laboratory that maintains this, I mean, this is a wide range, 60 to 85 C, should be able to control temperatures for all the tests that are in our program. So like, let's say they have a bath that maintain a certain temperature. This is not going to be too high or too low from what's expected in there, whereby they couldn't achieve that temperature. But the thought is if they start getting too far beyond, like below 60 or above 85, starts getting harder to maintain those temperatures for tests. I would say materials might not act the way they're supposed to act, especially if you've got any sort of viscosity testing going on.
Well, yeah, and temperature is such an important part of the testing. Like in so many tests, like they're required, like it's temperature specific of like, so it makes sense to me that the room should be, not too far out of those, like make it possible to run those tests within those temperatures. But also, just selfishly as a worker, I would not want to work in a building that was only 60 degrees. I could be just my warm blood not wanting that cold air. But also 85, 85. I don't want to work in it. I'm going to say my dexterity is going to be different in all of those situations at the extremes as well. So
absolutely. So what I explained to this person is that equipment, materials, and people are not necessarily going to operate according to the standard when you start getting into extreme temperatures, and that's extreme heat and extreme cold. The dexterity thing, I think, takes it really shows at the temperatures that are cold.
Oh yeah.
And we've seen it, and we have had laboratories try to get accredited that do not have any temperature controls, and it is just too cold.
Hmm.
And you see it because they can't run the tests.
Yes.
But for them to let's say we didn't have any requirement like this, and they somehow were able to cobble together things that one time for the 2 days and 2 to 3 years to be able to get the temperatures right.
Hmm.
uh, I don't have a lot of confidence if they don't really have any controls
Hmm.
whatsoever.
Hmm.
I don't have a lot of confidence as the accreditation body that they're going to keep up with this when we're
Yeah.
not there on top of them. So like we really need to make sure that as the accrediting body, we have confidence that the laboratories are going to be able to keep up with everything, maintain all the tests,
Hmm.
demonstrations or performance the way that they're supposed to be carried out in standards. And it really, if we don't have the confidence in that, then the laboratory might not qualify for accreditation. So this laboratory temperature range, while I would say it, justly has some questions
Hmm.
about, like you're asking, like where did these temperatures come from,
Yeah.
right? There wasn't an independent laboratory study to determine when dexterity starts to falter or
Hmm.
when the material, every material that's in our program starts to
Yeah.
change its viscosity or starts to fall apart. There was not a study done like that, so I don't have any numbers for people on that. Um, but I would also argue that at being in standards development this long, just about everything starts out as an arbitrary number. People pick a number
Hmm.
and it works and they go with it, and then other things build on that. They get years of data showing that yes, that was the right temperature, or maybe it was wrong, so let's ballot a change. So that happens too. So I don't want people to get too bent out of shape about maybe 60 wasn't the right number for the low, maybe 85 wasn't the right number for the high. um, but I will tell you one thing, and the other question that comes out of this one that I think is a good one is, why does it say when workers are present in normally occupied spaces? Is that, one of the questions that we get is like, why does AASHTO have like an OSHA requirement in here about workers? And I want to tell people where that came from. It is not an OSHA safety type requirement.
Hmm.
The original ballot didn't have anything about that wording in it. It
Hmm.
was just all the time should
Yeah.
be those temperatures. Now, one of the voters that submitted comments, it was a negative on this, said, that there isn't always testing going on. In
Hmm.
evenings and weekends, holidays, uh, there are times when there's no testing. So, does it make sense to make laboratories expend the cost of maintaining those temperatures when nothing is going on?
Hmm.
Presuming that cylinder curing is still maintained according
Yeah.
to, C511, M201 requirements, or whatever
Hmm.
other requirements for conditioning may exist. But if there's nothing going on, do they still have to maintain that? Might be
Yeah.
better to allow that, some allowance for that when there's no work going on. So
Hmm.
that is where that when workers are present language came from. So I want to make that very clear that it is not a OSHA safety requirement.
So is this one of the things, if we go back to the very beginning of the conversation in section 3.5.1, that if a laboratory's HVAC or heating and cooling capabilities go kaput, or that they are, their air conditioner breaks, that they have to let their quality analysts know within 60 days?
Yeah, I mean, they according to that section, yes, they should notify us if there's any significant change in their capabilities of testing. Where this can be advantageous to the laboratory is if they run into a long-term problem. For example, we've had some institutional laboratories that have a hard time maintaining their working environment, where they've had to basically go on a long pause
Mm.
and not be able to run tests at all for an extended period of time. And they wanted that to be identified because they were going to miss proficiency samples.
Mm.
They had to postpone an assessment. And in this case, we actually had to put their accreditation in suspension for a while they got this all worked out,
Hmm.
because it took a lot longer than the 60-day period.
Yeah.
And that actually allowed them a time to get things right and to be able to document that properly and say, we weren't doing work during this time because we were suspended and we asked for this allowance because we couldn't do the work because of our environmental conditions that we were dealing with. And they were able to tell the agencies that they report to about this and have it all documented and kind of, I guess, make sure that they were shown to do things the right way, which adds to the confidence level of that agency that is overseeing them. So at the end of the day, it worked out for them to be able to do that. I know a lot of our laboratories can't just do that. They can't just say, "Oh, we're going to be out of business for
Yeah.
3 months," and still actually be in business as a business. So I think it probably is less likely to be a long-term situation for a place like that. Small business. They usually jump on it right away, and they don't have the complications that a large institution might have.
I know there's a lot of, seasonal fluctuation in temperatures where perhaps, in winter, that is not a problem with the maintaining those temperatures, but in summer it might be a real problem. And is there any allowance for that, or what do we do in those situations?
There isn't. I mean, if they're operating, they're expected to adhere to these requirements. One thing I would say that we don't do, and I think this is kind of your question kind of triggered this thought in my head, is that there are labs in the northern United States that just shut down
Yeah.
in the winter, particularly if they're producing asphalt mixtures. There's no paving going on that time of year where they are. They're snowed in. Uh, people are laid off in some cases, or they're doing other jobs during that time period. And we have not required them to get suspended in those cases because they're not operating. And I'm torn on that because while I think it might make sense, I think that it would have to be some other name for it other than suspension
Like a
because
seasonal
no one,
shutdown.
yeah, because no one is like no one in their
Yeah.
area is operating. So it's not really like competitors are really,
Yeah.
taking advantage of this at that point. Like it doesn't really impact anything. But I also wouldn't want them to not be able to bid on contracts for the spring
Hmm.
when they are going to be operating because they're just shut down and everybody's shut down. But I think it would be good if we could address that somehow. I don't know exactly what that would look like at this point, though.
So is there anything else about that 3.5.14E that we want to talk about anymore, or should we go on? Because I know this subsection of this section goes down to I believe, and we're at E. So what
It
else do we
does.
got?
It does. There's just more about, work environment, testing environment has to not adversely affect the test results. They have to monitor, control, and record environmental conditions as appropriate. They have to demonstrate the capability of performing tests in accordance with the current version of the test specifications. That's kind of another one that I'm not sure needs to exist the way it does in here, while we do require that in other places.
Yeah,
Uh,
isn't that in the literature? Is there not a literature part? Maybe I'm making stuff
not
up.
specifically,
Oh,
but
I'm making stuff up then. Never mind.
yeah, I think there are requirements all over the place about that. The laboratory shall demonstrate adequate care when recording and processing data and test results, and shall demonstrate proper techniques for selecting, identifying, handling, conditioning, storing, and retaining test samples. A lot there.
There is, and I'm not going to help the conversation with this, but I'm still going to say it, and maybe I'll keep it, maybe I'll delete it. But who's defining adequate, proper, um, those words? Like, what is adequate care, and what are proper techniques? So I know
That
proper techniques are listed in the standard, and wouldn't that then be the standard and not need its separate thing?
Yeah, the hard part about some of this is um, we've got standard requirements. Not all test methods get into the details about selecting, identifying, sometimes handling, not always detailed enough. If there's conditioning, definitely. If there's storage, not usually. Retention, almost never are addressed. So there's a lot of things that just aren't addressed in test methods. And actually, excuse me, uh, back to that laboratory temperature thing, that's almost
Hmm.
never defined in the test method.
Yeah.
And I'm involved, as you know, I'm involved in ASTM and AASHTO standards development activities. And when we were going through this, I did talk to other people in standards development. I said, one of the things that people are asking me is why doesn't it say it in the test method? Like why almost no test method says what the room temperature is supposed to be. And most of the answers I got were, well, it's just assumed it's a laboratory and it's a controlled environment. I'm like, that's what I thought. But that doesn't help because people are telling, like, I have some people saying, we have no business defining temperature controls, and you're saying you don't need to define them because they're understood. But clearly they're not understood because somebody's disagreeing with 60 to 85 as being reasonable. So I think that what would be good is if a lot of these standards development organizations, subcommittee members would look at these things and say, well, if they do care about it, put it in there. But I don't think anybody is correct in saying the absence of a statement means that no one cares about it. It's just that it was an incorrect assumption made collectively, I would say, by a lot of people.
All right. Well, this was a very long discussion, as you said, but do you think that we have met the corrective action? Do you think this
Well,
has
this part of the corrective action.
Okay.
So
Okay.
I did
There's
talk
more
to
to
our
it.
staff. Yeah, there's more to it. I think we
Okay.
have more talking to do to other people on staff, to CCRL staff. And the last part of my corrective action is actually to take the recommendation from the complaint and go to our oversight committee with it. So what I want to do is present this in a fair, unbiased way. So I'm going to just take the information and I'm going to say, okay, we had a complaint about this. This person would like to see it change the app procedures manual. What do you think? And based on the result of that discussion, I will follow up and ballot. If there's a change needed, we'll ballot it and see where it goes. But I can't emphasize enough how important it is for us to be transparent and how much we actually do care about feedback and we do want to make changes where it is appropriate to make them, and that we will do it in an unbiased way. Does that sound good?
That sounds good to me. And I did want to put a plug in as we're preparing for our annual technical exchange that's coming up in March 17th through the 20th, 2025 in Bellevue, Washington. And I will say, as of the recording of this episode, there is a draft agenda on our website that is ashtoresource.org/events to check out that. And it has some registration information as well is now available.
Sounds good. I hope to see you there.
Thanks for listening to AASHTO Resource Q&A. If you'd like to be a guest or just submit a question, send us an email at podcast@ashtoresource.org or call Brian at 240-436-4820. For other news and related content, check out AASHTO Resource's social media accounts or go to ashtoresource.org.